So for the third task for our 11 to 12 bridging unit, we're going to cover the idea of an argument. Everything should always build to an argument in a subject like English literature. There's a lot you can find on YouTube and other sites that will talk about what an argument is. A lot of the time they'll relate to subjects like law, or they might relate to things like debating, sociology, anthropology, RS. You might often find arguments or advice on writing arguments might start by suggesting that you define something from the dictionary. Not a bad idea in most of those subjects, but I think in English literature it's not something you want to be starting arguments with. So an argument is something that I think the more times you're exposed to arguments, the better you'll get at forming them and noticing them. So what we're going to do here is we're going to quickly look at a text that I think almost every person watching this video will know, and we're going to think about what the difference between an argument and just an ordinary response to an essay might be, and then I'm going to set you something to think about with regard to Dante's Inferno. So let's think first of all about Of Mice and Men. Everybody knows it. If you don't know it, it's not going to do you any harm to read it anyway. There was a question a couple of years ago on Of Mice and Men asking about the role of animals in the text. Lots of students were terrified by that. This was actually going back quite a couple of years to before context was specifically and explicitly asked for in the question. So you'd be unlikely to get a question like that nowadays, because it would say, you know, how does it relate to the 1930s? So we're going to leave context out in terms of looking at what the responses might have been. Now, the way that most students train at GCSE to approach an essay question may overlook the opportunity to come up with argument in the way that you might want to do it at A-level. So a good answer to this question might go, right, there's time enough now for three main paragraphs. Let's think about animals in Of Mice and Men. Okay, there's the dog, Candy's dog. There's the mouse, or two mice, that Lenny hurts. There are other animals in the beginning and ending. In the brush, there's the water snake, the rabbits. You might want to write a paragraph on them. Or there's the horses in the stable that seem to warn when people are coming. And generally just then going after a paragraph on each of those. Let's think about an argument, though. I'm not sure how many of you knew or covered the Robert Burns poem, To a Mouse. The poem in which the poet overturns the home of a mouse and cuts it down when when scything through a field, when harvesting a field, and the mouse runs away. And this is where the novel's title comes from. The poet thinks about how he says, "Mouse, you're not alone in proving that foresight may be vain. The best laid plans of mice and men often go awry." So he says that the mouse, he then says that he envies the mouse, because he says that that the mouse, at least when the mouse built its house, wasn't worrying about the past or the future. The mouse was living in the moment, because not being human, the mouse, the present only touches thee, says Robert Burns. The mouse didn't have to worry about whether the house would last. The mouse was unaware that he was building his house in a field that was going to get cut down. And although the mouse is now done for, at least when the mouse was in that house, the mouse didn't know that the failure of the house was round the corner. Now, actually, why did Steinbeck use that poem for his title? Probably because he wants us to think about that idea. So here's a suggestion for an argument in perhaps answering that question. Why don't we think about how all the characters in the novel are worried about both the past and the future, particularly worried about the future often. Look at Candy, worried about no social care. George worried about what will he do with Lenny. Curly's wife worried about unhappiness. And all of them fixated on their past and how the past was better. Crooks as well, loneliness in the future, how in the past things weren't as bad. Could an argument be made that Lenny is the character in the novel who takes after animals because he is able to live in the present, and Lenny dies happily, and that Lenny is like the mouse? And could three paragraphs then be made where we could have a paragraph on Candy's dog and how the dog foreshadows Lenny and is a hint at the fact that Lenny is meant to be the key animal in the book, about how the mouse is a specific reference to Burns's poem and the title, and then finally a paragraph on humans in which you make your argument. So I think often in a good argument, the third paragraph is the one where the argument gets really put together. So 2 paragraphs maybe test the argument a bit, and the third one then looks to sort of build towards the conclusion. So we could then conclude that if we look at the humans, we're actually being made to think about the difference between being human and being animal. Being human means you have to worry about the future. Being animal means you can live in the present like Lenny does. So look at the difference between approaches there. Just coming up with 3 paragraphs that deal with the topic or theme. Great, but not an argument. Building an argument means you make a case, your opinion, and then you set out to sort of defend it and prove it and test it. Now, let's move on to Dante. Here's a challenge for you then to finish off the first part of our bridging unit. I'm going to make an argument about Dante. Good arguments tend to be simple. It's not my argument. I've got this from other people, but I'm going to make it here briefly now for you. Dante's Inferno resembles as a text neither the ancient mythology which has gone before it, so it doesn't really resemble, or you could say it partly resembles but partly doesn't, but it certainly doesn't belong to the ancient mythology, something like Ovid, the Tales from the Metamorphosis, or Homer, or Virgil. It doesn't resemble that, and it doesn't resemble the secular modern fiction that we enjoy nowadays. It doesn't resemble the plays in the Renaissance, where there's no mention of heaven and hell really that much in a lot of them, with the exception of the one you'll study in AS Lit, Dr. Faustus. And it doesn't resemble the popular novels then that came around in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, you know, your Dickens, Shelley. Doesn't resemble those. Dante's Inferno seems to sit between those 2 ages of storytelling. That's an argument that we could make about it. And then we could, of course, look at how it seems to have adopted bits from both. Does it sit in a transition point? So that's an argument I might make about the Inferno. Now, I'm going to set you a task, which is to think of an argument, put it together, and now you might want to do this as a little attempt at an essay, or you might want to do it as a mind map. A mind map is a nice way of developing arguments, actually. Mind map everything you can think of to do with the topic. Obviously, you wouldn't do this in an exam, but you've prepared more by the time an exam comes around. When you're first getting used to a text, mind map everything you can think of to do with the topic, and as you're mind mapping, see if an argument starts to form, and then once an argument forms, outline that argument in a sentence or 2 and think of what points for further development you might then take up, and then you have an argument. So I would say, you know, writing an essay plan would be a sufficient answer to response to this Common Task 3, and we'd be glad to see them if you wanted to send them in. So here's the challenge, right? For Common Task 3, I want you to make an argument on the following. I want to consider the role that a journey or travel plays in this text. What is the role of travel or journey in Dante's Inferno? And arguments on a postcard, please. Paul Blook.